if you want to understand modern vulnerability, you really don't need to look at a dark room full of hackers or, some hidden compound halfway across the world.
No, definitely not.
Right. You just have to look at a sunny afternoon in Orlando, Florida. You got tens of thousands of tourists perfectly bottlenecked into a theme park promenade, completely relying on their phones just to find the exit.
Yeah, and that's the scary part, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, we treat the concept of security in our daily lives like a transaction. We buy a home alarm system, we stick that little octagonal decal on our front window, and suddenly we feel like we live in an impenetrable fortress.
Oh, for sure. Or, someone takes a one-day concealed carry class in a nice air-conditioned room.
Exactly.
They shoot at a stationary paper target, and suddenly they feel like John Wick.
Right. But the reality is, if a car backfires in a crowded mall, I mean, most of us would probably trip over our own shoelaces.
Yeah. That false confidence is, it's probably the most dangerous variable in public safety today. We acquire the tool, whether it's an alarm or a firearm, we mentally check the box, and then we just sink right back into our comfort zone.
We really do.
And, comfort feels a whole lot like security, right up until the exact moment it suddenly isn't.
Well said. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to basically shatter that illusion. We want to explore a really startling perspective on public safety, terrorism, and what the word readiness actually means in the modern world.
It's a heavy topic, but a necessary one.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We're unpacking a pretty fascinating article published on March 13th, 2026. It was written by a 30-year career firearms instructor named Herfel, and it was published by Valortech, which is a tactical training organization.
Yeah, the piece is titled Florida Terror Threat Reality, Why Readiness Matters Now.
Catchy title.
It is, and it takes a very sobering, meticulous look at the state of Florida. The author argues that the public relies far too much on the theater of security, rather than the actual mechanics of survival.
Yeah, right.
He makes the case that true preparedness is vastly different and honestly vastly more complicated than just simply owning a piece of equipment.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, let's set some ground rules for you, the listener.
Good idea.
This source material discusses violent extremism, firearms, and public safety. And we want to make it absolutely clear up front, we are not taking a stance on the author's political viewpoints.
Right. No endorsements here.
Exactly. Nor are we endorsing this training company or their commercial services. Our role here is strictly to map out the fact-based arguments, the tactical logic, and the historical cases that the author presents.
We're just the messengers.
Yep, we are simply putting the information on the table so you can evaluate the anatomy of this argument for yourself.
And I think that distinction is crucial. I mean, this is about understanding the architecture of a threat, not adopting a specific ideology. And the architecture the author outlines is deeply thought-provoking because it really challenges our default assumptions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the author's argument about preparedness, we first have to understand how he defines the threat itself.
Right, which is completely different from how most people see it.
Totally. The source argues that most people visualize terrorism completely wrong. We tend to rely on these lazy, Hollywood-style sleeper cell fantasies.
Oh yeah, the bad guys plotting in a smoky room with a physical map.
Exactly. Circling specific buildings with a big red marker. And reading this, it instantly made me think of hurricane preparation down south.
Oh, that's an interesting parallel. Walk us through that connection. How does a storm track relate to counterterrorism?
Well, think about it. When a massive hurricane is forming out in the Atlantic, you don't know exactly where the eye of the storm is going to make landfall, right?
Right. The path is always uncertain and unpredictable.
Right, but you absolutely know which coastal areas have the most vulnerable infrastructure. You know which neighborhoods sit below sea level and will flood the fastest.
So emergency managers don't just prepare for a guaranteed, predicted path.
Exactly. They prepare based on the potential consequence. Applying that logic to this text, I really have to ask, is the author claiming these major Florida cities are officially confirmed targets on a terrorist hit list?
What's fascinating here is that the author anticipates that exact question. He addresses it head-on in his FAQ section, and the answer is an emphatic no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there is no confirmed centralized hit list. Instead, he introduces this concept of a consequence map.
The consequence map.
Right. He's mapping out environments where if a violent incident were to happen, The disruption, the sheer panic, and the resulting casualties would be the most catastrophic.
Makes a lot of sense.
It does, and he backs this up not with, internet paranoia, but with documented federal case history. He is looking at the actual historical behavior of extremist networks.
And the historical precedent he lays out is pretty heavy. I mean, he's not talking about hypotheticals here. He's talking about the actual federal counterterrorism record.
Yeah, let's look at the mechanics of those cases.
Yeah.
He points out the 2006 Liberty City case, where 7 men conspired to support al-Qaeda.
Great.
Then down in South Florida, you had the Qazi brothers case, which was tied to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP.
Wow. And then there was Orlando, right?
Unfortunately, yes. In Orlando, there was the tragic Pulse nightclub attack, where the shooter literally pledged allegiance to ISIS while on the phone with 911.
It's just terrifying.
It really is. And in Pensacola, an AQAP associate who was already inside the system carried out a deadly attack at the Naval Air Station. Add to that, multiple ISIS-related material support cases spread across Tampa, St. Augustine, Gainesville, and Kissimmee.
So the threat isn't this neatly labeled box with a specific zip code attached to it like a villain's lair.
Not at all.
It is a decentralized, opportunistic reality involving jihadist organizations, material support networks, and inspired lone wolf actors in a state that has incredibly high global visibility.
The key word there is opportunistic. The author makes a careful, very necessary distinction here. This is about documented violent extremism, not placing blame on entire religions or immigrant communities.
All right, that's an important clarification.
It is. It's about acknowledging the factual historical record and realizing that Florida, by its very nature, is a high-consequence arena.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the author reframes the threat around this idea of a consequence map rather than confirmed targets, we naturally have to look at where those consequences would be the most severe.
Which brings us to the logistics.
Yes, and the source dives into the staggering logistical numbers of Florida's major hubs. Looking at these stats, it made me wonder, does the sheer volume of everyday traffic actually become the weapon itself in these scenarios?
Oh, absolutely.
Are these areas vulnerable simply because they are so economically successful?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the exact vulnerability the author highlights. Let's trace that escalation of risk because it mutates depending on which region you look at.
Okay, let's start with Orlando and Central Florida.
Yeah, this region shows us the specific danger of sheer tourist density. In 2024, they welcomed over 75 million visitors.
That's just, I can't even wrap my head around that number.
It's massive. Orlando International handled more than 57 million passengers. The convention center alone hosted 1.7 million attendees.
Try to picture the psychology of that crowd. You have millions of people who do not know the local area.
Right, they're visitors.
They are relying entirely on GPS just to navigate massive transit nodes and theme parks. There are language barriers. They aren't mentally mapping out emergency exits.
No, they're looking for their vacation hotel or like a restroom.
Exactly. Now imagine the fluid dynamics of that crowd if a panic breaks out. 50,000 people simultaneously running in different directions, abandoning luggage, clogging choke points.
It would be chaos. And then 50,000 people simultaneously trying to call 911 or their family.
Which instantly jams local cell towers.
Yes, plunging the whole environment into a communications blackout. The environment itself becomes an obstacle to survival.
It's an unimaginable scale. But when you move over to Tampa Bay, the threat profile changes completely.
It really does. It's no longer just about crowd panic. It's about critical infrastructure.
Right. Tampa International sees almost 25 million passengers. But the real focal point is Port Tampa Bay.
Yeah, because it handles 43% of Florida's petroleum.
Almost half the state's fuel moves through that single node.
Think about that. A crisis, there isn't just a local tragedy. It is a cascading supply chain collapse that would paralyze transportation and emergency services across the entire peninsula.
That is terrifying. And then you couple that with the military symbolism of U.S. Central Command CENTCOM at MacDill Air Force Base.
Exactly. You are overlaying a massive civilian population on critical energy movement and high-value military targets.
The compounding factors are everywhere. Look at South Florida. Fort Lauderdale's airport pushes through over 32 million passengers, and to Port Everglades moves 4.1 million cruise passengers.
The international connectivity there creates a massive porous web of movement.
And then look at Northeast Florida and the Panhandle to complete the picture. You have heavy military presence with Pensacola, which already suffered that insider AQAP-linked attack, and Jacksonville adds an incredible layer of logistics scale.
Yeah, J-Export handles 1.4 million TEUs.
And for those unfamiliar, TDUs are 20-foot equivalent units, the standard measure for those massive steel shipping containers.
Right. Plus, they handle over 10 million tons of cargo and 500,000 vehicles a year.
So the real takeaway from mapping these hubs is that the economic engine of the state, the tourism, the military bases, the fuel movement, the massive cargo ports, all of it creates a deeply complex physical environment.
It complicates prevention immensely.
And it would drastically slow down the response time to any kind of crisis. A single committed actor doesn't need a highly sophisticated bomb to cause a catastrophe when the environment is already that saturated and fragile.
Exactly. The crowd and the infrastructure do half the damage for them.
Which demands an entirely different level of preparedness. You cannot approach an environment that complex with a minimalist security mindset.
No, you really can't.
And that brings us to a really critical pivot in the source material. Now that we've established the massive scale and density of these environments, how do individuals usually respond to this risk?
Usually, not well.
The source addresses a really dangerous misconception: the belief that purchasing a tool instantly downloads the skills required to survive a crisis into your brain.
Right, like the Matrix.
Exactly. Think about it like golf. Imagine practicing your golf swing at a perfectly quiet driving range on a sunny day.
Sounds nice.
You hit the ball straight every time, you feel like a pro. But then, to play the actual game, you have to hit that drive while the ground is literally shaking, people are screaming at the top of their lungs, and you have to recite the alphabet backwards.
That is a wildly different scenario.
Right. That static range training does absolutely nothing to prepare you for the chaos of the actual event.
Yeah.
But I have to push back a little here on the author.
Go for it.
Fellertech is a firearms training company. Aren't they just pointing this out to sell their own force-on-force high-stress classes? I mean, is getting a state concealed carry permit and buying a gun really just theatrics like the author claims?
Well, it is entirely fair to question the commercial bias of a source. But if we strip away the sales pitch and analyze the physiological and tactical validity of the argument, the author's point is clinically accurate.
Okay, how so?
His core argument is that a firearm without judgment, without stress exposure, and without legal understanding is not just ineffective, it is actively dangerous to the public.
Wow.
He breaks down how the human body processes violence in crowds, and it is nothing like the movies.
Because the body basically betrays you. Adrenaline dumps, time compresses, and people lose their fine motor skills.
The physiological response to a sudden violent threat is brutal. The text points out that situational awareness completely collapses. You experience auditory exclusion, meaning your brain literally stops processing certain sounds to focus on the threat. Blood shunts away from your prefrontal cortex, the logical part of your brain, and moves to your major muscle groups for flight or fight.
So you stop thinking and just react.
Exactly. If you have only ever trained in the sterile conditions of a quiet, controlled shooting range where you are relaxed and breathing normally, your brain has no neural pathway for that level of chaos.
You'll just freeze.
You will freeze, or worse, you will make a catastrophic mistake.
The author specifically says a one-day certificate is not preparedness. A social media-fed sense of confidence is definitely not preparedness.
Because surviving the initial loud noise is only step one. The text heavily emphasizes medical trauma training, specifically massive bleeding control.
Which people never think about.
Never. In a chaotic mass casualty event, emergency medical services will stage outside the area until police declare it a cold zone.
And that could take hours.
It could. You have to be your own first responder. If you carry a weapon but don't carry a tourniquet or know how to pack a wound, your readiness is fundamentally flawed.
And then there is the legal and psychological aftermath, which the source argues is just as perilous.
Oh, surviving the physical event leads immediately into the legal event. The author stresses the necessity of understanding use of force law, civil exposure, and knowing how to handle post-incident law enforcement contact.
Right, because if you draw a weapon in a crowded mall, you are responsible for every single round that leaves that barrel.
Including the ones that miss. Confidence, built in sterile conditions, hides the brutal reality of what a public space crisis actually demands.
So what does this all mean? If a single person with a permit isn't ready for the chaos of a crowded environment, what happens when we scale that failure up?
That's the real nightmare.
What happens when the institutions managing those massive crowds we just talked about, the churches, the schools, the corporate campuses, are equally unprepared?
It gets really messy.
The author asks some alarming questions here. Consider the scenario. You have a well-meaning but untrained volunteer security guard in a crowded church. An incident happens.
Right.
If you have armed staff or armed citizens pulling weapons in the chaos, how on earth do responding police know who is the active threat and who is the good guy?
They don't.
Doesn't the presence of good guys with guns who haven't rehearsed together create a deadly identification problem?
This raises an important question, and it highlights a massive nightmare scenario for modern law enforcement. The author states plainly, if your organization has no communication protocol, no rally points, and no realistic physical rehearsals, your security is built on hope.
And hope is not a tactical strategy.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of your church scenario. Police enter a chaotic scene with fire alarms blaring. Their adrenaline is through the roof. They see multiple people in civilian clothes with firearms drawn. If those volunteers haven't been rigorously trained on how to instantly identify themselves, drop their weapons, and de-escalate their posture for responding officers, the results can be instantly tragic.
Blue on blue or police on civilian-friendly fire is a massive risk.
Huge risk. But the author doesn't just point out the problems, though. He leans heavily on federal guidance to lay out what institutions should actually be doing to fix this.
Which is helpful. We need solutions.
He grounds his argument in established, proven protocols. He cites the Department of Homeland Security's "If You See Something, Say Something" campaign, focusing on the mechanics of reporting pre-operational indicators.
Like spotting things before they happen.
Yes. The message is to look for the behavioral baseline of an environment and report anomalies early. Do not wait until a weapon is visible to report suspicious behavior.
That makes a lot of sense.
He also points to ready.gov, emphasizing the run, hide, fight protocol. But knowing those words isn't enough. An organization has to map them to their specific building.
He runs through a list of very hard questions that every school, church, and business needs to answer. And honestly, if they can't answer them, they're just relying on luck.
Let's look at the operational reality of those questions. In a crisis, who exactly is designated to call 911?
Right.
And who is responsible for staying on the line to relay live updates to dispatch? If everyone assumes someone else is calling, no one calls.
Bystander effect.
Exactly. Who has the authority to initiate a lockdown versus an evacuation? What if the main entry point to the building becomes the kill zone? Do the employees know the secondary exits?
Those are tough questions.
And who actually has the medical trauma gear? And more importantly, who has stress tested their ability to apply a tourniquet while their hands are physically shaking?
I always just assumed that the armed security personnel working at these massive malls or corporate campuses had rigorous, specialized state training.
A lot of people assume that.
But the author has some incredibly sharp criticism for Florida's regulatory oversight regarding the people hired to protect these spaces.
He essentially shatters that assumption entirely. He critiques what he calls Florida's minimum standard mentality.
What does that mean?
He specifically points out a dangerous gap in Class G training oversight. A Class G license is what is required for armed security in Florida.
Okay.
The author argues that the state mandate requires bare minimum hours of instruction, heavily focused on basic marksmanship, with virtually no requirement for stress testing, force-on-force decision-making, or complex crowd management.
So an institution might hire an armed guard, feeling like they've solved their security problem, when in reality they've just hired someone who is only certified to shoot a piece of paper on a sunny afternoon.
The broader argument here is that this isn't just a tactical disaster waiting to happen, it is a massive legal liability.
I can imagine.
If an institution hires poorly trained security, or if a church relies on a volunteer team that has never run a physical rehearsal, they are exposed on every single front.
Right. A pristine security plan sitting in a 3-ring binder in the manager's office is totally useless when the adrenaline hits, the fire alarms are screaming, and the exits are jammed.
A plan on paper is just the suggestion until it has been pressure tested in the physical world.
We have covered a lot of intense ground today, but we want to bring this conversation back to you, listening right now.
Always.
Whether you live in the heart of Central Florida or you are sitting in an office building on the complete other side of the globe, the core lesson of this deep dive transcends geography completely.
It forces us to look in the mirror. We have seen how massive infrastructure, supply chains, and huge concentrations of people create cascading consequences during a crisis.
Right. It's not about paranoia.
No, it's about acknowledging the architecture of reality. True readiness requires stress-tested decision-making. It requires actual medical capability and cohesive, rehearsed planning.
It is about actively stripping away that false sense of security we talked about at the very beginning.
The author leaves us with a stark, uncompromising warning. A plan that has never been rehearsed is not a plan.
So we want to leave you with this final thought to mull over or maybe explore on your own today. Think about the sterile conditions of your own life right now.
Yeah, look around.
Look around the room or the train or the coffee shop where you're listening to this deep dive. If the fire alarm went off this very second and the lights cut out,
Great, complete darkness.
would you rely on a consciously rehearsed exit strategy? Or would your brain freeze, forcing you to just follow the panicked crowd, hoping the person in front of you knows where they're going?
Recognizing the difference between those two reactions is the first actual step toward readiness.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay aware, and stay prepared.